Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, alright. See Melkor, I got you. Alright, could Sweden have withstood a German Blitzkrieg in World War II? This is from TIK. They had a very informative video for me about how the Germans in World War II didn't really have much of an option for going for the oil fields in the Caucasus, like making Soviet Union an enemy. I always thought, maybe focus your forces in Northern Africa and try and get oil in the Middle East. That's me assuming that there's the infrastructure to take it out of the ground, barrel it, send it to Europe. So I know this is going to be a great video. Let's do it. Oh, Roald Amundsen, is that who I have with me? I know he's Norwegian. He's not Swedish. These people have nothing to do with the stuff I'm reacting to. If they ever do, it's a coincidence. Obviously, he's Norwegian. There's actually, I have it right here. This video right here, I've like fallen asleep to this video like 100 times. I don't know what it is about it. It's just soothing to me. But it's about the Scott Amundsen racing Great Britain racing Norway to the South Pole. It's a great video. I'd recommend checking it out. But let's get right into it, all right? If you're not ready to learn, get the hell out of here. Right now, get out. Unless you just want to chill, that's fine. Let's go. It's hot in here. 1 second. Okay. Let's do it.
My patron, Peter Cadia, has asked, question, Sweden's capability during World War II. Dear TIK, first of all, my most honest and warm thank you for your efforts making marvellous videos. Now to my question. Our Swedish history lessons tell us that Sweden wasn't attacked by Germany due to a few major facts. First, our silent allegiance was already with the Germans, so why attack friends? Secondly, we were trading heavily with them, so why attack a trading partner, and so forth. But if they were to attack us, we couldn't withstand an attack. Our forces were mainly half-drunk farmers with a hunting rifle standing at our shores. In one of your episodes, you say that Germany didn't attack us because Sweden would have stopped them before they could reach the precious mines in the north. What is your analysis of this? Could Sweden withstand an attack for so long, or did they abstain from attacking us due to the above history teachings? Kindly, Peter Cadia. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, and I think the best way to answer this question is to first look at the Swedish military and political situation throughout the war, assess whether Sweden did or did not align themselves with the Germans, as you mentioned, and then see what the German plan was for the invasion and if they had any chance for success.
Let's do it. I'm ready. I don't have much coffee. I might pause later to get coffee. Before we start, no, I'm good for now. All right. Okay.
Can't possibly mention and was for the invasion and if they had any chance for success. I can't possibly mention everything about Sweden during World War II in this video, and no doubt will get called out for missing something. So, if you like more information, I'd recommend these two books for you, especially Gilmore's Sweden, the Swastika and Stalin, because that's specific to Sweden. Anyway, let's start by looking at Sweden's strategic situation.
I'll just let him get into it, but I am curious to learn. I'm kind of building up curiosity as the seconds go by here, as I'm thinking more about it. Wow, look at all those lakes in Finland. It looks kind of like Canada. If you ever zoom in on a map in like Google Maps of Canada, there are, I don't know the exact number, I'm exaggerating, but it looks like millions of little lakes, and I'd imagine that's a bit what's there, kind of receding of glaciers. But you got the USSR attacking Finland to your east. You got Norway being occupied to your west, I believe, right? Guys, I am definitely a student here. I am not a teacher on this channel. So let me know if I say something wrong. I'm sorry if I sound definitive when I'm not. And obviously you got Germany to the south there. So yeah, let's get into it.
Looking at this map, anyway, let's start by looking at Sweden's strategic situation. Looking at this map, it becomes obvious why Hitler was so anxious about the Scandinavian region. From Denmark and Sweden, Allied planes could bomb Berlin, and an Allied force could threaten an attack into Germany. So, unlike the First World War, the Germans wanted to secure their northern flank. Obviously, Hitler saw the Eastern Front as the priority, but Hitler believed that the Northern Front was the most important of the Northern, Western and Southern fronts, which is why he kept a lot of divisions in the area even until the end of the war. In fact, one of the strategic objectives in his directive for the invasion of Scandinavia was to prevent British intervention in the region. And as many historians point out, the most important Scandinavian resource that needed to be secured for the German war effort was Swedish iron ore coming from her northern iron ore mines. Until Germany took the French mines in Lorraine, the Germans would be dependent entirely on Swedish iron ore. And even once France was overrun, Swedish iron ore was a boost to the German economy, so securing Swedish cooperation for deliveries of the ore was necessary. During the summer months, the ore could be shipped from the Swedish port of Luleå, which required the Baltic Sea to be secured. But in the winter, the Baltic Sea ports were frozen, so the ore had to be moved via rail to Narvik on the Norwegian coast. In order to secure a constant shipment of ore from Sweden, the Germans would have to take...
Just have a question here. Is it ever get frozen enough where, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but kind of, like, could you walk from Sweden over the ocean into Finland, like in like a really super cold winter? That'd be like, technically, I know it'd still be a long walk, but
control of
a long drive.
Norway, constant shipments of ore from Sweden, the Germans would have to take control of Norway and Norwegian territorial waters to prevent the British from blockading the route. For the British, if they were to properly blockade Germany like she had in the First World War, then she would need Norwegian cooperation. Or just disregard Norwegian neutrality, like Britain did in practice. Thus, Churchill was mining Norwegian waters before the German invasion of Norway and Denmark was launched, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Winding the clock back slightly, in 1925, the Swedes had 4 army divisions, and as tensions mounted in Europe, this was increased to 6 divisions in 1936, which they hoped to have had fully mobilized by 1947. Of course, the rapidly evolving events in Europe compelled them to speed things up a bit. By 1939, though, the Swedish military was completely unprepared for war. Some of their rifles and uniforms dated back to 1896. They didn't have enough machine guns, and of the 600 artillery pieces they did have, 400 of them were pre-World War I types. They had
that is cool. I didn't even notice the scope until it said it up there. Wow. That's cool.
400 of them were pre-World War I types. They had no tanks, believing that the terrain in Sweden was unfavorable to them, and the 150 aircraft they had were inadequate even when compared to the Soviet airplanes, let alone the Germans. Gunther, Sweden's foreign minister, told the British in the February of 1940 that the Germans would be able to obtain immediate and complete domination in the air and could destroy every city in Sweden. In addition, at sea, the 3 Swedish battleships were between 15 and 20 years old, and there was a 6-vessel deficit in the essential submarine fleet. Because Sweden had got most of her equipment from abroad, they had a host of different standards for things like ammunition, and once the war started, they quickly ran out of countries to purchase equipment from, since nobody wanted to arm Sweden for fear she would go over to the other side. But the Germans owed the Swedes for their iron ore shipments, which were the main strategic asset that the Germans wanted from Sweden, and so started to give them artillery, hand grenades, machine guns, radio equipment and ammunition. Switzerland also gave them anti-tank guns, and Finland sent some grenade launchers.
It's interesting. There's almost like this awkward relationship. I think awkward is the perfect word, really. Just this awkward relationship at this point with Sweden and the surrounding countries and the two different sides of the war, or the war to be. And I'm waiting to see why Germany, well, didn't do exactly what this is going to explain. So
launches. The Swedes also increased their domestic production, which from 1940 Switzerland also gave them anti-tank guns, and Finland sent some grenade launchers. The Swedes also increased their domestic production, which from 1941 onwards included tanks and other armoured vehicles. Once Sweden declared her neutrality in the conflict in the September of 1939, the Swedes signed the 1939 Anglo-Swedish Trade Agreement, as well as another deal with the Germans. Declared her neutrality in the conflict in the September of 1939, the Swedes signed the 1939 Anglo-Swedish Trade Agreement, as well as another deal with the Germans, which granted several trade ships to deliver supplies to Sweden by going through the British blockade. The Germans allowed this because they secured annual shipments of 10 million tons of iron ore from the Swedes, and it also allowed them to pressure Sweden into accepting other concessions because the Germans could threaten to cut off this lifeline. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact resulted in the occupation of the Baltic states.
I just want to try and get in the... So, the reason that... So say, I'm thinking in Germany's perspective, let's say you just launch all-out war against Sweden, and you block, British shipping, and I'm not even sure you would need a navy to match Britain if you just want to block them in this area around Denmark. Maybe you do, but it seems like they're like the thought process of this kind of like soft with a hint of like, we're going to do something if you don't accept it, is that it's probably easier to get the resources this way and have the annoyance of them being neutral rather than under your control. Because if you try to invade them and they resist in any way, then you're going to have to go and conquer those places and make sure people get the iron ore out. And maybe at this stage, Sweden as a trading partner is a better route.
The other concessions because the Germans could threaten to cut off this lifeline. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact resulted in the occupation of the Baltic states and the Winter War, which Sweden reacted to by mobilizing 2 army divisions and by giving the Finns military equipment for free. Sweden supplied 84,000 rifles, 575 machine guns, 85 anti-tank guns, 104 anti-aircraft guns, 112 howitzers and field guns, 25 airplanes, 30,000 shells, and 50 million cartridges, partly from its own meager supplies and partly by diverting export orders from Germany to Finland.
So Sweden obviously sees Finland as a guard against the Soviet Union. So that's going to be a strange relationship with Sweden, or between Sweden and Finland. Maybe not strange, but I'm sure Finland knows that Sweden knows if Finland falls to Russia or to the USSR, then they're on your doorstep. So,
in fact, in 1937, the Swedes had planned for 4 possible military scenarios: 3 aggressive moves from the Soviet Union, which they saw as the main enemy, and only 1 from Germany. And up until 1940, it did seem that the Soviets were the main enemy. However, in the January of 1940, the Soviets became willing to negotiate an end to hostilities and approached Sweden to meet.
Sorry, I just want to... I've been saying a lot of stuff kind of with everything in the war in mind. Everything that happened. When... You got to realize, I have to, and we have to realize that this isn't even 1940 yet, so
mediate a
decisions
peace.
Are more difficult.
In late 1939, Churchill wanted to disrupt Swedish iron ore supplies to Germany. He began by advocating that British warships be allowed in Norwegian waters, and Churchill wanted to disrupt Swedish iron ore supplies to Germany. He began by advocating that British warships be allowed in Norwegian waters, and when the British proposed this, they received a harsh backlash from both Norway and Sweden. Churchill then broadcasted a speech on the 20th of January 1940, warning that war would come to Scandinavia. On 16th of February, Churchill ordered a violation of Norwegian territorial waters in order to rescue 300 British seamen imprisoned on board the Altmark in Josselford. This successful operation sealed Norway's fate because, as a result, Hitler and his...
When was this... So May 10th, 1940. Okay. Okay, so Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was late August of 1939. Invasion of France was May of 40. Just trying to think about what else is going on around.
Board the Altmark in Josselford. This successful operation sealed Norway aboard the territorial waters in order to rescue 300 British seamen. Relation contested the Navy territorial war. On 16th of February, Churchill ordered a violation of Norwegian territorial waters in order to rescue 300 British seamen imprisoned on board the Altmark in Josselford. This successful operation sealed Norway's fate because, as a result, Hitler and his admirals noted that neither did the British respect Norwegian neutrality, nor the Norwegians assert it. By the time of 1940 and the invasion of Norway and Denmark, the Swedes now saw Germany as their main threat, even though the Germans asked the Swedes to stay out of the conflict. The bulk of their divisions were deployed on the border, with some forces further back to combat paratroop landings. And as the German invasion of Scandinavia got underway, the Per Albin line, on which millions had been spent, was garrisoned with a few barely trained conscripts who had only 50 to 80% of their required weaponry of machine guns and anti-tank guns that most did not know how to operate. From April 1940, Sweden was effectively blockaded by both Britain and Germany. Between April and June 1940, the Germans pressured the Swedish into granting them transit rights, which they only accepted in July after all...
Do they still see the Soviet Union? I have a lot of good Scandinavians in that Discord and subscribers who know their history too, so I know I can get a lot of my questions answered. But I don't want to make this too long. At this point, is the USSR still seen as your major threat, even after the UK and Germany are now fighting over Norway, and therefore Sweden is going to be... So at this point, they say Germany is a bigger threat than Great Britain, but is the USSR still a greater threat than Germany to them? Because if so, if you feel alienated... I just noticed that Finland and Sweden look... Sorry. If you feel alienated from these two, you're going to feel ultra vulnerable to the USSR. That is, if they're, a giant thorn in the boot, All right, I was trying to check on something else. So yeah, I'm wondering about
granting them transit rights, which they only accepted in July after all other options were ruled out. They were surrounded by either German or co-belligerent Axis partners and the Soviet Union, which was currently allied to the Germans. So, without any way for the British to lend them support, act ruled out. They were surrounded by either German or co-belligerent Axis partners and the Soviet Union, which was currently allied to the Germans. So, without any way for the British to lend them support, they had to give in to German pressure. This was understandable since the Swedish economy required both coal and fertilizers, which only the Germans could now supply.
I feel like that, sorry, I'm getting caught in a thought while letting it go. It's even if they're allied with Germany, that almost might seem like the USSR is more of a threat because Germans might not protect them against the Soviets. Obviously, I need to learn more.
So, without any way for the British to lend them support, they had to give in to German pressure. This was understandable since the Swedish economy required both coal and fertilizers, which only the Germans could now supply. Therefore, if the Swedes didn't want to starve, they had to cooperate with the Germans. Being surrounded placed Sweden in a position that was so bad that when Per Albin Hansson was re-elected as Swedish Prime Minister in the September of 1940, his opponent sent him a one-word telegram saying,
Look at those eyebrows.
September of 1940, his opponent sent him a one-word telegram saying, condolences. The Germans continued to be elected in a position that was so bad that when Per Albin Hansson was re-elected as Swedish Prime Minister in the September of 1940, his opponent sent him a one-word telegram saying, condolences. The Germans continued to press for further concessions over the next few months. Condolences. The Germans continued to press for further concessions over the next few months, with Sweden concerned about more Soviet moves against Finland, as well as the Allied blockade on Europe. The Swedes knew that they couldn't survive forever without help from outside of Scandinavia, so they created a plan to take Narvik in order to secure a western port, which would allow them to trade with the West, but otherwise they were in a hopeless situation. The Swedes had 220,000 men in the November of 1941, and 2 divisions could...
That's how big the German army was? If you were asking me to guess, I would have guessed the Red Army was larger. Over 70.
Now be deployed within 48 hours to defend the iron ore mines east of Narvik. The British assessment of Swedish capabilities in 1942 said that they could resist a German attack for barely 2 weeks. At the time, the Swedes confidently rejected this assessment and said that they could hold out for 3 months. But a German study in October 1943 concluded that the Swedes had shortages of anti-aircraft guns, tanks and artillery, although deemed that Swedish soldiers were well trained in rifles and operations in forests and rough terrain. The Germans believed that the Swedes would fight like the Finns had done in 1939. The Allies also reassessed the Swedes again in late 1943, believing they could resist the Germans for about a month. This wasn't very long even at this stage of the war, when the German Wehrmacht was weakened by the defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk. But while conventional warfare would probably have resulted in swift defeat, Sweden had taken steps to nurture irregular forces to resist occupation. Swedish rifle clubs had 200,000 members nationwide and a home guard, which was set up in 1940. This raised 85,000 members, who were later supplied with automatic weapons in 1941. And in late 1942, these locally organised units were formally brought into the regular army in order to centrally organise the defences of the country. A Free Warfare Force was set up as well. This was a secret combat group of Swedish commandos that would be launched into Finland or Norway to carry out behind-the-lines operations against enemy communications and supplies. So clearly the Swedes had plans and preparations for actions against Germany, and were resistant to German demands, even though they had to give in to pressure in the early and mid-war. But it would probably be wrong to suggest that they were secretly aligned to Germany, since the Germans themselves were frustrated by Sweden's uncooperative behaviour. Germany also expressed interest in the positioning of Sweden within the new German-centric European constellation. Various German officials declared themselves disappointed that Sweden was failing to adjust to the new situation. The Swedes could see the German build-up in Finland, and it was in Sweden's interest not to allow Finland to fall into Soviet hands, nor have Finland go over to the Axis. It was also in Finland's interest to secure Swedish support, and so the Finns offered a political union with Finland in the September of 1940. The Finns agreed that foreign policy would in the September of 1940. The Finns agreed that foreign policy would be conducted by the Swedes, and Finland would not attack the Soviet Union. But the Germans and Soviets rejected not attack foreign policy union. But the Germans and Soviets rejected this proposal, and so the union didn't happen. On the 22nd of June 1941, as Barbarossa was launched, the Germans demanded that Sweden allow one division of troops to be transported overland through their country. The Swedish agreed, but stipulated that this concession would be a one-off and that Sweden wouldn't be asked to join the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Swedish king did send a message to Hitler thanking him for crushing Bolshevism and hoped for Hitler's success in the matter. But this by itself doesn't necessarily mean that Sweden was aligned with the Germans, since the Swedes were also negotiating with the Allies. On the 31st of March,
I gotta say, they really aren't doing bad in a very bad... They're doing actually very well in a bad situation.
42, Operation Performance was launched. Norwegian ships that had docked in Sweden were allowed to sail to Britain after the Allies had demanded that they be set.
Like, the more the video goes on, I'm like, oh, ooh, well, kind of like, that's what, I guess TIK is a very good channel. I'm seeing pattern. It's just very good at dismantling common held history beliefs. I think, like, once you start to dive a little bit into history, there's a lot of things that seem commonplace but are a little misconstrued. For example, Hitler going into launching Operation Barbarossa. I think TIK did a good job at kind of pointing out how he didn't have much of a choice. And so there are a lot of things that you need to deep a little bit deeper, and you ultimately realize that even in hindsight, there's not much that they could have done.
Free. The Germans sank after the Allies had demanded that they be set free. The Germans sank 3, forced another 3 to be scuppered, and 2 fled back to the Swedish ports. Only 2 made it to England. But to Britain, Norwegian ships that had docked in Sweden were allowed to sail to Britain after the Allies had demanded that they be set free. The Germans sank 3. 1940 also negotiating. Operation Performance was launched. Norwegian ships that had docked in Sweden were allowed to sail to Britain after the Allies had demanded that they be set free. The Germans sank 3, forced another 3 to be scuppered, and 2 fled back to the Swedish ports. Only 2 made it to England. But clearly this operation...
Or does scuttled mean completely taken apart for scrap, or does it mean repurposed into your own ship? I think that's what it is.
...was not done for Germany's favour. The Allies also... Clearly, this operation was not done for Germany's favour. The Allies also repeatedly requested that transit rights for German troops through Sweden be restricted, which over time, as the strategic situation slowly turned against the Axis, the Swedes began to implement. Swedish opinion became even more hostile following a round of executions in Trondheim on 6th of October, and the deportation of 532 Norwegian Jews to Germany on the 25th of November as part of the Nazi final solution. Some have argued that Sweden shouldn't have cooperated with the Axis at all, and that their
Look at all the Alex
Axis policy was deliberate and wrong. Argued that Sweden shouldn't have cooperated with the Axis at all, and that their
I thought he was rolling up people who disagreed with him. I didn't even look at the Patreons over there.
As part of the Nazi final solution. Some have argued that Sweden shouldn't have cooperated with the Axis at all, and that their pro-Axis policy was deliberate and wrong. Well, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I don't...
Yes, from an idealistic and moral standpoint, Sweden shouldn't have given in to German demands. But the problem is that if the Swedes had stubbornly rejected all German demands, at the very least, they would have been isolated and their economy...
I feel like people... I don't want to say that any position is... I mean, I don't know enough about... I even feel like World War II is one of the subjects I kind of know a bit more about, but obviously I have a lot to learn. But when someone says a blanket statement like that, if I have said any, please call me out. But I'm just like, well, did you even think what would happen? It's just like, oh, they went with Nazis, therefore they're Nazis or they're idiots. It's like, did you even think about, okay, they say no, then what happens? And
German demands. But the problem is that if the Swedes had stubbornly rejected all German demands, at the very least, they would have been isolated.
Sweden and Finland look like a cock and balls. All right, I had to say that. All right, it was just getting in my mind too many times.
Only rejected all German demands. But the problem is that if the Swedes had stubbornly rejected all German demands, at the very least, they would have been isolated and their economy would have imploded. And at the worst, the Germans could have invaded in the 1940 to 1943 period. As you will hear shortly, and as I mentioned in my previous video on Scandinavia, there was a German plan to invade Sweden. So, while we can sit here on our lofty moral thrones and judge the Swedes for cooperating with the Third Reich, the practical situation basically forced their hand, and it's clear, in my opinion, that the Swedes only cooperated to a certain extent, and as soon as they could get away with it, they started to distance themselves from the Germans. The British at the time, including Churchill, believed that Sweden was truly a neutral nation that was caught in a difficult position, and indicated that they understood the situation. US opinion, on the other hand, was that Sweden wasn't really neutral and was in fact on the side of the Germans. They thought that Sweden should be blockaded fully, which they believed would shorten the war, and the USA also demanded that the 2 remaining Norwegian ships in port be allowed to sail back to the Allies, and that the Allies be allowed to use a higher proportion of the Swedish merchant fleet outside her territory. The Swedes had little choice but to agree, although the ships weren't sailed but their cargo was smuggled out to the west instead. The Germans responded on the 15th of January 1943 by stopping the 4 monthly supply ships coming into Sweden from the west, and now Hitler realised that Sweden was backing the Allies. In the early months of 1943, Hitler's chronic fear of an invasion of Norway, reinforced by recent events in North Africa and by the growing hostility of Sweden, continued unabated. The North African landings appeared to indicate that the Allies were committed to a strategy of attacking on the periphery of Europe, which made Norway a likely next target. Sweden, regarded with lingering suspicion since the summer of 1941 when it refused to join Hitler's crusade against Bolshevism, became a new source of apprehension in 1942 as its policy towards Germany stiffened in direct proportion to the increasing danger of Allied landings in Scandinavia. If the Allies did land in Norway, the Germans feared that the Swedes would return to strict neutrality or even convert Sweden to the Allied side. This would cancel German transit rights through their country, isolating their units in the northern parts of Norway if the Allies landed in the south or the middle. It would also isolate their forces in Finland, and so they began to stockpile 8 months of supplies in the Narvik area and began preparing an operational study in early 1943 for an invasion of Sweden. General Lieutenant Adolf von Schell, who was commanding the 25th Panzer Division, was ordered to prepare the study, which he did. Schell had his own Panzer Division armed with a mixture of German and French tanks, 1 other infantry division, and strong air and Fallschirmjäger paratrooper support. It was hoped that this force would overcome the Swedish military, even though the Swedish military was at least twice the size of the German invasion force. One portion of the German force would strike in the north, supported by paratroopers, but the main strike would come from the south over the Norwegian border, with additional forces landing on the coast north of Uppsala. The von Schell plan had the additional advantage of not requiring an Allied invasion to trigger the attack. Germany could equally move against Sweden without it. However, it strikes me as a bit of a desperate plan. Von Schell's first concern was to devise tactics suitable to the terrain of Sweden and capable of execution with relatively weak forces. Deciding that an attack through the mountains of western Sweden would have to follow the roads and valleys, he chose to rely on the shock effect of a swift, almost reckless advance. In my opinion, if an invasion of Sweden was going to be successful, the Germans would have had to have attacked in the 1940 to 1941 period, before the beginning of Barbarossa, so that they could muster enough forces to actually mount it. Yes, the von Schell plan may have eventually resulted in Sweden's collapse, but there was a danger that the offensive would get bogged down, and the Swedes did intend to fight on if they lost the conventional fight. So, in my opinion, the best way to guarantee victory would have been for the Germans to have launched the attack in 1940 or 1941, when they could gather enough forces to actually mount a successful attack, at a time when the Swedes were pretty weak and mostly not mobilized. Going back to Peter's original question, the Swedish military may or may not have been half-drunk farmers with hunting rifles, but the German force in 1943 was, in my opinion, too weak to guarantee outright victory. In fact, the Norwegian force in 1940 had been barely 20,000 men strong, and Sweden's military was over 200,000 in 1943, and 300,000 reservists were called up in the August. Why did they call up the reservists? The Swedes found out about the attack plans and mobilized in July of 1943, partly because of it, and partly because they were about to terminate the transit agreement with the Germans anyway, since they were being pressured to do so by the Allies, and this was before the plan was properly finished and prepared. Therefore, to attack with just a handful of under-equipped infantry divisions, one panzer division with half outdated equipment and some paratroopers was probably not going to result in a swift victory, and even if it had, the Swedes most likely would have destroyed their own iron mines before the Germans had secured them. So, was it worth the effort? The Battle of Kursk ended in failure, and the 25th Panzer Division was diverted to France in anticipation of an Allied attack there. The rest of the Army of Norway were in no position to support this attack, as they had been whittled down by troop transfers. They didn't think they could hold against the British, let alone attack Sweden as well. Allied pressure continued to mount, culminating in the Swedes informing the Germans that they would end all military transit for them on the 1st of August 1943. The timing of the secession was favourable, however, as German attention was diverted away from Sweden towards the fall of Mussolini in Italy and a large Soviet offensive on the Eastern Front. Hitler had his hands full, and the termination was accepted without much trouble. So, the von Schell plan fell through, and no invasion of Sweden took place.
Honestly, the more I learn about this, the more it seems like Sweden had to go through this obstacle course with flaming saws and saws and flaming arrows, flaming saws, and people shouting, and they just had to not go too offensive, not go too defensive, and it seems like they did a pretty good job considering all the circumstances of doing as little damage as they could while powers like Great Britain, the UK, and Soviet Union are going all at it. The
Swedes now started receiving pressure from both the Allies and the Soviets to break relations with Finland. Sweden responded by actively seeking a separate peace for Finland, which she did by becoming the mediator between the Soviets and the Finns. This allowed talks to begin in Sweden between the Finns and the Soviets from late March 1944. A peace was signed that September, with Sweden playing an active role. On the 12th of June 1944, the Swedish agreed with the Allies to reduce exports of ball bearings to Germany by 60% for the next 4 months, but they explained that they would have to make up the shortfall in late 1944. From July, they stopped
What would you use ball bearings for? Probably a lot of things. But the first I think of is turret, moving the aim of turrets, maybe tank in factories too, conveyor belts,
transit of coal and cement through to Norway, and later cut shipping to Germany by half. All ball bearing exports to Germany were stopped on the 12th of October 1944, and all Swedish and German trade ceased on the 1st of January 1945. The Germans responded by formally withdrawing permission for the Swedes to continue receiving their 4 ships a month from the Allies, even though they continued to receive those ships and the Germans made no moves to stop them. From 1943 onwards, Sweden trained Norwegian and Danish exiles as so-called police troops. so that they could reoccupy their own countries once the Germans laid down their arms. The main reason they did this was because they feared a communist takeover of those two countries, and they didn't want to be surrounded again by one power bloc.
Smart. So they wanted to shore up their defenses again so that Soviet Union couldn't take advantage of a weakened Sweden.
Of those two countries, and they didn't want to be surrounded again by one power bloc. These police troops, though, were armed with grenade launchers and anti-tank guns, so they definitely weren't regular police. Well, these police troops entered Norwegian territory on the October of 1944 as the Red Army chased German troops out of the north. The war now ended on 9th of May 1945 with Sweden intact as an independent and neutral state. The battle for independence against Hitler was now ended. The struggle to resist the Soviet Union would continue for some time. So, to fully answer Peter's question, I think the main reasons Germany didn't invade Sweden was because they couldn't spare the troops during the Denmark and Norwegian campaigns, which went on as the invasion of France was getting underway, and had no real reason to do so in the 1941 period. It was only as the tide of war turned and Sweden began to be less cooperative with the Third Reich that Hitler considered invading Sweden. But by then, the Swedish army, though certainly under-equipped and arguably incapable of resisting a full-scale offensive, was large enough to counter or at least hinder the weak invasion force that the Germans could spare to attack them with in 1943.
I just want to say this channel does a great job in telling people who are, people like me, I guess, who are like, well, what, you know, tend to speak with more confidence when we don't know enough about it. Like, why didn't the Germans just go to North Africa and Middle East and get oil? Or why didn't, you know, why would Sweden, why were they with the Nazis or whatever? And this channel is great at going, hey, calm down. Stop talking, calm down. Let's hold your hand. Let's go through the certain things. And you start going, yeah, but, all right, your guess. And then you start going in the other direction of like, wow, they actually did pretty well. Yeah, I'm going to wait till the end of the video.
Arguably, Sweden's reluctant cooperation with the Germans in the early and mid parts of the war was wrong, but it reduced the need for the Germans to invade their nation. When the Swedes started to be less cooperative, it was too late. I hope that answers your question, Peter. And to everyone else, do you agree with me? If not,
yes, but I'm no...
How would you answer Peter's question?
Yes, but also I don't know. I don't have enough, same amount of knowledge as this guy to really say I agree because but he made a very great
Let me know
case.
in the comments below.
Awesome video. Yeah, this channel is great at making you shut up and pay attention, and then, hey, if you still think the way you do afterwards, fine. Great video, Melkor, thanks for that. TIK videos have been very good, very informative. Rauld, see you, brother. All right, see you guys next time.